the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Reading The Cruelest Miles, the heroic story of dogs and men in a race against an epidemic, by Gay Salisbury and Lainey Salisbury. Curtis Welch was the only doctor for hundreds of miles along this forgotten edge of the Bering Sea, and for the past 18 years he had watched winter descend suddenly, as it tends to do up in the far north. There were just 2 seasons here, they said, winter and the 4th of July. Winters were at least 7 months long in Nome, and the other seasons came and went within a few short weeks. From July to October, the Bering Sea was free of ice, and the town was open to steamboats and schooners that sailed in from Seattle, the closest major port, about 2,400 miles and 14 days away to the south. By early November, the Bering Sea would be frozen over until the following spring, and the light would be nearly drained from the sky. The Victoria, usually the first passenger ship to arrive in spring and the last to leave in the fall, would have unloaded its cargo and headed south, leaving the town cut off from the world, save for one route, a dog sled trail that linked the town through the interior of Alaska to the ice-free ports in the southeast. The unrelenting cold came on suddenly and violently, with blizzards that lasted for days and brought about an extreme isolation that could sap the determination of the hardiest soul. Finally, a cavernous silence would descend on the coast like a great listening. At night, as the cold hung over the land, all of Nome's wildlife and every dog and his master would hunker down. The slightest movement could puncture the Arctic stillness, for the extreme cold amplified each sound. Far out at sea, one could make out the thunderclap of floes crashing into each other, and a hunter on land could hear the crunch of reindeer hooves on the crisp snow a few miles away, or the sound of a dog chewing on a bone. It was as if the great ice age had returned. Each fall, nearly half the town's population left aboard the last ships of the season and stayed away until spring. And yet, Welch stayed behind. Dr. Welch had gone through his checklist more than once in the final days before the Almeida left that fall. There would have been cotton balls, ether, tongue depressors, thermometers, and medicines that needed replacing. While most of the medical supplies had arrived safely, one item was missing. Earlier that year, in the summer of 1924, Welch had noticed that the supply of diphtheria antitoxin had expired, and he had made a point of ordering up a fresh batch through the health commissioner's office in Juneau. In all of his 18 years of practicing medicine in the Seward Peninsula, he had not seen a single confirmed case of diphtheria, the deadly childhood disease. Then, on the afternoon of Tuesday, January 20th, it all came to a head. As he was making his rounds at Maynard Columbus, Welch checked in on a 3-year-old boy named Billy Barnett, whom he had admitted almost 2 weeks ago after the boy developed a sore throat, swollen glands, fever, and fatigue. Within days of entering the hospital, Billy had presented a disturbing new symptom: thick grayish lesions in his throat and nasal membranes. The gray and bloody ulcers on Billy's tonsils and in his mouth cavity were characteristic of an ancient and dreaded bacteria, a centuries-old killer of young children, which, for good reason, was often referred to as the Strangler. Its official name is diphtheria. Diphtheria is an airborne bacteria that thrives in the moist membranes of the throat and nose and releases a powerful toxin that makes its victims tired and apathetic. In 2 to 5 days, other more deadly symptoms would appear: a slight fever and red ulcers at the back of the throat and in the mouth. As the bacteria multiplied and more toxin was released, the ulcers thickened and expanded, forming a tough, crusty, almost leathery membrane made up of dead cells, blood clots, and dead skin. The membrane colonized ever larger portions of the mouth and the throat until it had nowhere left to go and advanced down the windpipe, slowly suffocating the victim. It was a slow, painful, and frightening way to die. The majority of victims were young children between the ages of 1 and 10 years, and the anxious, struggling, pitiful expression of impending suffocation in child after child infected during one epidemic, as a doctor described it, deeply affected physicians. Welch knew the odds were stacked against him if he didn't find a fresh supply of serum, as the disease was highly contagious. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. Mail is only form of transportation. Stop. I have made application to Commissioner of Health of the Territories for antitoxin already. Stop. There are about 3,000 white natives in the district. End of communication. Welsh Relief Station 295. So the Nome epidemic kept getting worse and worse. More and more children were dying off, but the nearest antitoxin was in Anchorage, nearly 1,000 miles away. Now, you may be wondering why Nome was in such a remote location. It was a gold town that had just randomly sprung up and was really hard to get to. The only way this time of year was by sled dogs, as planes couldn't handle the gale-force winds that were blowing. Governor Scott Bone mapped out a safe route for the 20-pound cylinder of serum, and it was sent by train almost 300 miles from Seward to Nenana, where it was passed just before midnight on January 27th to the first of 20 mushers and more than 100 dogs, who relayed the package 674 miles from Nenana to Nome. This book covers all of the heroic mushers' stories. They disobeyed what is called the Rule of the 40s, which says that no one should run their sled dogs in weather above 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below -40. The mushers of the 1925 Mercy Run, as it was called, definitely disobeyed that rule. -40? Try -85 below with wind chill. Anyway, all of the mushers' stories are well worth the read, but we're skipping to the last few mushers, one of them being the great Leonard Seppala, who was famous for introducing the Siberian Husky to the American public. Seppala completed arguably the most difficult part of the race, the part over the ice of Norton Sound. When we pick up the story, he's traveling swiftly towards where he thought the serum was, and he doesn't know that the serum is actually being taken out to him. Seppala just happens to notice the other musher with the serum, and had it not been for this miracle, it would have probably never got to Nome. Leonard Seppala had covered nearly 170 miles in the past 3 days, and so far he had been lucky with the weather and the ice. As far as he knew, he still had more than 100 miles to travel before meeting the serum, and he needed to spare himself and the dogs the exhausting ordeal of battling a storm and dangerous ice. Suddenly, his lead dog Togo and the other dogs picked up speed. They were racing, but after what? And then he saw it. There was another sled dog team up ahead. It wasn't moving. Instead, the driver was standing in the middle of the team, flailing his arms. A reindeer had wandered out on the trail, and his dogs were fighting to get at it, all snarled up in a tangle of lines and flying fur. Now, Seppala's dogs wanted to join the pursuit of game, and they put on a burst of speed. Seppala held on tight. It was like being at the end of the line in a game of Crack the Whip, which Nome's children played on their ice skates out on the Bering Sea. When the other drivers saw the Siberian Huskies coming toward him, he knew he had more important things to do than get his dogs away from the reindeer. There was only one man who could be out on the trail today with a team of Siberians heading the opposite direction. He began to wave his arms frantically, determined to catch Seppala's attention. But Seppala, who could not make out what the driver was shouting above the whistling of the wind, had no intention of stopping to help. He could not afford the delay. Togo was approaching the team rapidly. Henry Ivanov, whose mission it was to pass the serum to Seppala, made one last attempt to get his attention. His dogs had probably broken a few harnesses in the fight, and some may even have been injured. If he failed to get Seppala's attention, he would have to return to Shaktuluk and take the time to mend the harnesses and find more dogs. Ivanov ran towards Seppala as the musher raced past. "The serum!" he shouted. "The serum! I have it here!" Seppala at first didn't believe what he had heard. He slammed on the sled brake. The brake made little purchase against the snow, and it was only after some distance that he managed to stop the dogs and turn them around into the wind. By the time Seppala made his way back to Ivanov, the driver had stopped the fight. He ran over to Seppala with the serum and told him of the change of plan. The epidemic had spread rapidly since Seppala left his daughter in Nome on January 28th, and more drivers had been added to the relay in order to speed it up. It was Seppala's job now to carry the serum back across Norton Sound and onto the roadhouse at Golovin, where Charlie Olson was waiting for the handoff. He could take the long route around the shore, but neither he nor Nome could afford the extra day of travel. Seppala had his own daughter to worry about. Sigrid was only 8 years old, his only child, and he had no way of knowing if she was on Dr. Welch's growing list. Seppala may have had his doubts about recrossing Norton Sound that afternoon, but the rest of the world did not. Most of those talking were former sourdoughs who had moved to the States several years ago, but who still had the gambling spirit of the gold rush days in them and were ready to bet their final ounce of dust that Seppala would reach his destination in record time. The kind of confidence these Alaskan sourdoughs had in Seppala, Seppala had in his lead dog Togo. When he saw the huts of Umgalik up ahead, Seppala turned left without hesitation and headed out across Norton Sound. It was now dark. The temperature, as he would later estimate, was minus 30 degrees, and the gale was in his face. With the wind chill, it was a brutal 85 below. There was nothing Seppala could do but drive as if he were in a race. Seppala had been out on the Sound with Togo once before in a northeast gale. He had been just a few miles offshore when, in a lull between gusts, he heard an ominous crack. He ordered Togo to haw, but the leader had already felt the crack and was heading at top speed towards the nearest point on land. He was closing in to shore when Togo inexplicably reared up and somersaulted back onto his teammates. Seppala shouted angrily. This was no time for circus stunts. He ran up to Togo to see what was the matter, and as he neared the dog, he saw why he had stopped. No more than 6 feet ahead was an open channel of water. He was on a floe, drifting out towards the sea. He straightened out the dogs and skirted the edges of the floe, looking for an opportunity to escape, but there was none. It had been noon when he set out from the shore at Isaac's Point, and now night was falling and the temperature dropping. There was nothing he could do but curl up with his dogs, conserve his strength and his warmth, and hope for a shift in the wind to bring him into shore. Several hours later, no such shift had occurred, and Seppala's anguish grew. His dog sensed the change in his mood and let out a long and low plaintive cry. Then Togo gave a short yelp. The leader had sensed a shift. The wind was beginning to blow on shore. Seppala hitched his team back up and waited. He drifted for 9 more hours until he could see the shoreline only a few hundred yards ahead. The ice raft was closing in on a floe that had jammed up against the shore-fast ice. Seppala mushed along the perimeter to find a place to jump off. The closest point on the raft to the floe was about 5 feet, too wide for Seppala to jump. But if he could get Togo to the other side, the dog could pull the 2 floes together. Seppala tied a long tow line to Togo's harness, picked him up, and hurled him across the open channel. Most dogs would have run away after a stunt like that, but as Seppala later reported, Togo seemed to understand what he had to do. Once on the other side, Togo dug his nails into the floe and lurched toward shore. The line snapped. Togo spun around and looked back across the chasm at Seppala. The line slipped into the water. Seppala was speechless. He had just been given a death sentence. Animal psychologists have a phrase for the ability to find solutions. It is called adaptive intelligence. The icy lead separating Togo from Seppala was keeping the dog from his reward, reuniting with his master and his team. Togo had been born and bred a northern sled dog, and it was part of his instinct now to pull. From an early age, he had been exposed to an amazing array of daily challenges that had improved his ability to learn and in some cases to solve problems. He had traveled over various terrain in summer and winter and had spent most of his entire day for the past 12 years watching and working with Seppala as the team traveled out on the gold fields and to towns across Alaska. As Seppala stood staring across the lead at Togo, the dog dove into the water, snapped the line up into his mouth, and struggled back out onto the jammed-up floe. Holding the line tightly in his jaws, Togo rolled over the line until it was twice looped about his shoulders, and began to pull. The floe started to move, and Togo continued to pull until it was close enough for Seppala and his teammates to jump safely across. Now, as Seppala and Togo crossed Norton Sound in the late afternoon of Saturday, January 31st, Seppala had no choice but to put his faith in Togo one more time. It would be the last time the two would cross the Sound together. As Seppala feared, it was already too dark for his own eyes to see anything. The wind was deafening. Occasionally, he leaned out over the sled, listening for any clue that the ice was cracking up. The Sound was holding, and Togo seemed unfazed by the wind, covering the miles of trail with his head held low and his body level in deep concentration. He kept a straight course, despite the hummocks and slippery patches of ice that loomed up in his path. At 8 p.m. that evening, Seppala and Togo pulled up the bank at Isaac's Point on the other side of Norton Sound. The dogs had traveled an incredible 84 miles that day, half of it against the wind, and they were all worn out. Togo and the team had averaged 8 miles per hour. They were hungry and needed a rest before battling the wind for the next 50 miles to Golovin. Seppala unhooked the dogs and fed them salmon and seal blubber. They wasted no time in curling up their tails and going to sleep. The next day, some 13 hours after the start at Isaac's Point, Seppala's team arrived at its destination and passed the serum to Charlie Olson. It had been a seamless effort. Since Seppala had picked up the serum from Ivanov on the shore ice of Norton Sound, he and his dogs had traveled 135 miles, more than 2.5 times the distance covered by any of the other drivers. And this was done at top speed, in blizzard conditions over heaving ice. Looking at them, you would never know. All they needed was a rest. It was a testament to Seppala's training, conditioning, and skills on the trail. The time was a little before 3 p.m. Now, all that stood between Golovin and Nome was the final stretch of 78 miles. But these last miles would be difficult. It was a serious concern that these drivers would never make it to Nome. This was already shaping up as an extraordinary blizzard. Even experienced mushers wouldn't want to tempt fate under these conditions. If just one driver in the relay got lost or blown off course by the storm and couldn't reach the warmth of a roadhouse, the ampoules of serum would eventually freeze, expand, and crack, thus ruining the supply. Dr. Welch at Nome knew this. Violent blizzard now on is delaying progress, he wired his colleagues at the Public Health Service. Have ordered antitoxin stopped, as I wish to take no chances on its freezing or being lost to save a few hours. As the message came through, the connection crackled and the line went dead. Nome lost what little communication it had with the drivers and could only pray that the message had reached Casson, the next man in the relay. It would not. 50 miles east on the other side of Cape Nome, Gunnar Casson sat in the roadhouse at Bluff. He had no inkling of the meeting in Nome or the decision to hold off the relay. At around 7 p.m., Casson heard a faint shout outside. It had to be Olson. Casson pushed open the door. It was clear that Olson had had a bitter ride. His hands were too numb from frostbite to unlash the serum, and his 7 dogs, short-haired for sled dogs, were stiff in the groin. Casson helped the musher inside the roadhouse and sat him down. Then he went back outside to retrieve the serum and bring the team inside. They couldn't have gone much further, Casson observed. It had taken Olson nearly 4.5 hours to travel the 25 miles from Golovin to Bluff. Putting on the dog blankets had nearly cost him his fingers. The wind chill temperature had been well below minus 70 degrees, and in such weather, a driver could expose his hands for only 30 seconds at a time before the flesh freezes. It had taken Olson, of course, much longer to blanket his 7 dogs. In the warm cabin, Olson pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white and hard as stone. At best, it would be days before their full use would be restored. As they sat in the roadhouse, Olson told his story. The wind had repeatedly blown the team off the trail, and at the lagoon just outside Golovin, a gust of hurricane-force winds slammed into the rig, hurling him and the team into a nearby drift. Olson had fought in the dark to dig his way out and untangle the dogs, but the struggle had worn him out. Despite his 2 parkas and a double fur hood, the 46-year-old bachelor could not keep warm in the blizzard. Olson was as tough as they come in Alaska, accustomed to the rugged demands of mining alone in the Northwest. He had seen the worst that the Seward Peninsula could throw at a dog team, and for a moment he thought he would not make it. He warned Casson to hold off. It was good advice. Casson would heed it, but only to a point. Two hours later, the wind still had not died down. If anything, it had risen and was getting colder. It was 10 o'clock, and the temperature was minus 28 without the wind chill. Snow was coming down fast and being blown by the wind. If he didn't leave now, the trail to port safety, 34 miles away, would be impassable with drifts. Casson made his decision. There wasn't any use in waiting. He would head out. Casson said a brief goodbye to Olson, opened the door, and stepped back out into the night. Few drivers had the courage, the know-how, and the dogs to face a blizzard head-on. No amount of movement can keep a musher warm in such conditions. Most travelers caught out in a blizzard stop and make camp, yet even that can be a dangerous business, for on this coast there are few trees to fuel a fire. Sourdoughs had a saying for the times when they found themselves stranded by a blizzard: "We are up against it good and strong." 5 miles into the run, Cassin's worst fears materialized. Since leaving the roadhouse, the wind had sanded the trail down to a hard and fast crust. But here by a ridge, a towering drift had formed, blocking the trail. Balto, Cassin's lead dog, tried to run his way through, but he and the other dogs quickly became mired in the snow. Cassin waded in after them to clear a path, but he too floundered as the snow rose up to his chest. There was just no way the team could get through to the other side, except by retreating and then going around the ridge. Cassin had to turn the dogs around. He grabbed Balto's harness, and together they dragged the team in a tight arc through the drift and back out the way they had come. Getting around the ridge would be difficult. Balto had worked largely on the trails to the various dredge sites beyond Nome, and Cassin was asking the dog to find an unfamiliar trail in an unfamiliar territory in the pitch dark of the blizzard. Cassin could barely see 100 feet ahead of him. Balto lurched forward and tentatively plowed his way through the snow along the back of the ridge. He understood that he had to regain the trail to find the faint scent of dogs that had pattered before him that winter. Balto kept his nose low to the ground, his ears flattened against his head to keep out the wind as he moved slowly over the snow. A dog's sense of smell is at least 600 to 700 times more powerful than that of a human, and Balto was capable of smelling the tracks left behind by other dogs several feet beneath the snow. A canine's paws too are sensitive and would help Balto feel the hard-packed surface of a trail that had been covered over by snow. Minutes passed like hours. They were beyond the ridge, and still Balto searched. Suddenly, the dog lifted his head and broke out into a run. They were back on a trail. A few miles farther on, the trail turned hard again as Cassin entered a valley. It was Topcock River, its frozen surface wiped clean of snow by the wind. His right cheek began to sting with frostbite. Crossing the river as he neared the west bank, Balto stopped. Cassin went to the head of the team and saw a large stretch of overflow that Balto had run right into and now refused to go further. It was shallow but deep enough to have soaked the dog's feet. Cassin turned the team off the river, dried Balto's feet, and then moved on. The last and highest of the ridges was Topcock Mountain, the brutal 600-foot climb with a long, exposed summit. Mushers generally tackled Topcock only in the daylight. The trail hugged the rocky cliffs, but with the wind howling down the slope, a driver could quickly become disoriented. It was here that Seppala nearly lost his life during his first sweepstakes race in 1914. The dogs crawled on their bellies as they fought their way up. Cassin's right cheek went numb from the cold. "Topcock is hell when it's storming," Cassin would later recall. "It was storming when I got up there." Upon reaching the summit, Cassin jumped back into the sled and held on as the dogs raced along the summit. For more than an hour, the blowing snow had been so thick that Cassin couldn't see the trail and could only guess at his position each time Balto crossed another lagoon or creek. He had given control of the team over to Balto, and his new job now was just to hold on. "I didn't know where I was," Cassin would later recall. "I couldn't even guess." Then, in a lull between gusts, Cassin recognized a vast depression in the land up ahead. He was well beyond Solomon. It was 2 miles back. He had missed the roadhouse, which was just north of the trail. It was then that he made a decision, the most controversial of the entire race. He would push on to port safety. He could rest later. It takes a 60 to 70 mile per hour wind to flip a sled, and throughout his journey, Cassin had struggled to keep the rig down. Finally, he was overwhelmed. Entering the blowhole, Cassin did not have enough strength or weight to keep the sled upright. Several times the sled was hurled off the trail, dragging the dogs with it. Each time, Cassin had to take off his gloves, untangle the team, and right the sled. Before crossing to the other side, a final gust slammed into the sled. Cassin found himself buried in a drift. He crawled in the darkness back to the sled, righted it, and fumbled with the dogs' harnesses. He patted the sled down with his hands to make sure the serum was still in place. He worked his hands up and down the basket, first methodically and then frantically. It was gone. His stomach tightened. The worst had happened. Casson dropped to the ground and crawled around the snow, probing in the darkness with his bare hands for the serum. His right hand hit against something hard. He grabbed it. It was the serum. He lashed it back to the sled, gave it a few extra turns with the rope, and fled this devilish stretch of land. Around 5:30 a.m. on Monday, February 2nd, Casson could make out the outline of the cross above St. Joseph's Church. Within a few minutes, he pulled up onto Front Street and stopped, exhausted, his eyes stinging from the cold, dry air outside the door of the Miners and Merchants Bank of Nome. Witnesses to this drama said they saw Casson stagger off the sled and stumble up to Balto, where he collapsed, muttering, "Darn fine dog." So that was the Mercy Race to Nome of 1925, and today Alaska still commemorates it with the Iditarod Race, which is absolutely my dream to run. I hope this heroic story has inspired you as much as it inspired me, and I thank you so much for listening. Godspeed.